James Mitchell pulled his worn military jacket tighter against the December wind, settling against the cold marble columns of the Pemberton Hotel for another freezing night on the streets. The disabled veteran had no idea that 50 floors above him, a man stood at a penthouse window, watching with an intensity that bordered on obsession. Richard Pemberton, the hotel's billionaire owner, should have called security to remove the homeless man from his property. Instead, he stood frozen, his hand trembling against the glass, unable to look away from the figure below, because in that moment, something in James's quiet dignity, in the way he arranged his few possessions with military precision despite having lost everything, stirred a memory Richard had spent 3 years trying to bury. Before I continue the story, please subscribe. I need to reach 1,000 subscribers so I can keep bringing you stories like this every day. It's just one click for you, but it means a lot to me. Thank you. The December wind cut through the Chicago streets like a blade, but James Mitchell had endured worse. He had survived the scorching deserts of Afghanistan, the explosion that shattered his left leg, and the even crueler return to a country that seemed to have no place for broken soldiers. Now, at 43 years old, he made his home against the gleaming marble columns of the Pemberton Hotel, one of the most luxurious establishments in the city. The irony was not lost on him. Behind those golden revolving doors, guests paid more for a single night than he had seen in 6 months. They emerged in furs and designer suits, stepping over him as if he were simply part of the architecture, another fixture of the urban landscape they had learned to unsee. But James maintained his dignity like a soldier maintains his weapon. His corner was immaculate. The cardboard he used for insulation was folded with military precision when not in use. His worn olive-green jacket, the same one he had worn during his service, was faded and frayed at the cuffs. But he kept it as clean as possible, brushing off the dirt each morning. On the left breast, just above his heart, a small American flag pin caught the street light. It was tarnished now, the red and blue barely visible, but he polished it every day with the edge of his sleeve. His prosthetic leg, visible where his jeans rode up, was an older model, scratched and dented from years of use. The VA had promised him a better one. That was 2 years ago. He did not beg with outstretched hands or aggressive pleas. Instead, he sat quietly with a small paper cup before him, offering a gentle nod and a sincere, "God bless you," to anyone who dropped in a coin or a crumpled bill. When people ignored him, he did not curse or shout. He simply watched the world pass by with eyes that had seen too much, understood too much. Tonight, as the temperature dropped and the first snowflakes began to fall, James arranged his few possessions with care. A tattered blanket, a small backpack containing everything he owned, a photograph of a woman with kind eyes, protected in a plastic sleeve. He did not know that high above, someone was watching him with an interest that went beyond pity, beyond casual concern. Someone who saw not just a homeless veteran, but a ghost from his own past. 50 floors above the street, Richard Pemberton stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse office, a glass of 30-year-old scotch untouched in his hand. The city sprawled beneath him like a circuit board of lights, each pinpoint representing lives he would never know, stories he would never hear. His office was a monument to success. Mahogany bookcases lined the walls, filled with first editions he never read. Original artwork worth millions hung in perfect lighting. The desk, imported from Italy, was large enough to seat 12, yet he sat there alone every night. His phone buzzed incessantly on the leather surface. Text messages from his assistant, calls from business associates, an invitation to a charity gala. He ignored them all. On the credenza behind his desk sat objects that did not match the corporate opulence. A triangular wooden case containing a folded American flag, its glass front reflecting the city lights. The brass plate beneath it was turned away from view, but Richard knew what it said. He had traced those engraved letters with his fingers 1,000 times in the dark. Beside it, a framed photograph in simple black lacquer. The image showed a young man in military dress uniform, standing at attention. "Oh, pride radiating from every line of his posture, but the face was angled just slightly away from the camera. Caught in a moment of looking towards something beyond the frame, features obscured by shadow and distance, Richard never looked at that photograph directly anymore. He could not bear it. His dinner sat cooling on the conference table, delivered from the hotel's 5-star restaurant below. Pan-seared salmon with asparagus, plated with the kind of artistic precision that would make it worthy of a magazine cover. He had eaten 3 bites. The rest would go to waste, as it did every night. He was raising the scotch to his lips when movement below caught his eye. A figure against the marble columns of his hotel's entrance. Richard stepped closer to the window, his breath fogging the glass. The man below was arranging something, moving with a deliberate precision that seemed oddly familiar. Even from this height, Richard could see the discipline in those movements, the military bearing that no amount of hardship could fully erase. Something twisted in his chest. He pressed his hand against the cold glass and watched the homeless veteran settle in for the night. And for the first time in 3 years, Richard Pemberton felt something other than the hollow ache of grief. He felt recognition. Richard was about to turn away from the window when he saw her. An elderly woman, laden with shopping bags from the designer boutiques that lined Michigan Avenue, struggled past James's corner. The wind caught one of her bags, tearing it from her grasp. Oranges rolled across the sidewalk, scattering into the gutter. The woman cried out, reaching for them, but her arms were too full, her balance too precarious. James moved. Despite his prosthetic leg, despite the cold that must have stiffened his joints, he pushed himself up and began gathering the fallen fruit. Richard watched, transfixed, as the veteran chased down each orange, carefully wiping them clean against his jacket before placing them gently back into the woman's bag. The elderly woman was speaking, gesturing. Even from 50 floors up, Richard could read the gratitude in her body language. She reached into her purse, pulled out what looked like bills, extended them toward James. The veteran shook his head, firmly but politely. He refused. He said something, smiled, and waved her on her way. The woman hesitated, clearly wanting to insist. But James had already returned to his spot against the marble column, settling back down as if nothing had happened, as if he had not just given kindness to a stranger while sitting in the cold with nothing. Richard's hand tightened on his glass. A memory crashed over him, sharp and vivid. Michael, at 17, stopping on their way to dinner to help a homeless man whose wheelchair had gotten stuck in a grate. Michael emptying his pockets without hesitation, without expecting thanks. Michael saying later, his voice so earnest it hurt to remember, "Dad, we're not better than anyone else just because we have more. We're just luckier. And luck can change in a heartbeat." Richard's vision blurred. He reached for his phone with trembling fingers and dialed the security desk. His head of security, Marcus, answered on the first ring. "Mr. Pemberton, sir?" Richard's voice came out rougher than he intended. "The man outside, the veteran by the main entrance. I want him observed, not removed." There was a pause. "Sir, I can have him moved to another location if he's bothering guests. We have protocols for—" The word came out sharp. Richard softened his tone. "Leave him be. Watch over him. Make sure he's safe. No one touches him. No one moves him. Is that understood?" Another pause, longer this time. "Yes, sir." "Understood." Richard hung up and returned to the window. Below, James sat in the falling snow, unaware that his simple act of humanity had just altered the course of his life. Over the next 4 days, Richard Pemberton found himself drawn to that window with increasing frequency. His morning meetings were cut short. Conference calls were taken while standing at the glass, phone pressed to his ear, eyes fixed on the street below. His assistant noticed but said nothing. The entire executive staff had learned long ago not to question the boss's eccentricities, especially after his son died. But it was the security team that was truly baffled. Marcus had relayed the unusual order to his staff. "Watch the homeless veteran. Do not remove him. Ensure his safety." They took shifts, filing reports that Richard actually read, each one adding another piece to the puzzle of James Mitchell's character. On Tuesday morning, James shared his breakfast with a stray dog. A mixed-breed mutt, all ribs and matted fur, had appeared at his corner. James had 2 breakfast sandwiches, acquired from a church outreach van that made rounds at dawn. He ate half of one, then carefully unwrapped the other and tore it into pieces for the dog, speaking softly to the animal as it ate. The dog returned every day after that. On Wednesday afternoon, a family of tourists stopped near his corner, arguing over a map, clearly lost. James stood, approached them politely, and spent 10 minutes giving them detailed directions to Navy Pier. He drew a simple map on the back of their brochure, showed them which bus to take, even warned them about the tourist traps to avoid. They tried to give him money for his help. He refused, saying, "Just happy to help, folks. Enjoy Chicago." Thursday brought freezing rain, and James fashioned a shelter from a piece of plastic tarp and cardboard, creating a lean-to against the building. But when another homeless person, an older man who seemed disoriented, wandered by shivering violently, James offered him the shelter. James spent that night in the open rain, his jacket soaked through, while the stranger slept protected. Richard watched it all, each act of quiet heroism, each moment of dignity maintained despite impossible circumstances, each choice to give when he had nothing. The veteran never panhandled aggressively, never harassed guests, never made a scene. His cup remained before him, humble and undemanding. Some days it held a few dollars, some days it held nothing at all. James's reaction never changed. Friday evening, as Richard stood at his window nursing his nightly scotch, Marcus called. "Sir, I have to ask, why are we watching this man?" Richard was silent for a long moment. "Because I need to understand something." "Understand what, sir?" "Whether goodness can survive anything," Richard whispered. "Even hell itself." The storm hit Saturday night with a violence that caught even the meteorologists off guard. Wind speeds reached 50 miles per hour, driving snow horizontal across the city. The temperature plummeted to 8 degrees, with a wind chill that made exposed skin dangerous after mere minutes. The streets emptied. Even the most desperate sought refuge. Shelters overflowed, turning people away. Churches opened their basements. The city activated warming centers in every ward. But James Mitchell remained at his corner outside the Pemberton Hotel, because he had learned the hard way that leaving your spot meant losing it forever. Territory was everything when you lived on the streets. This corner was his. It was sheltered enough to be bearable most nights, visible enough that people passed by regularly. If he abandoned it for a shelter, someone else would claim it by morning. So he stayed, huddled under the small overhang, his body curled into the tightest ball possible. His thin blanket was useless against this kind of cold. His jacket, still damp from Thursday's rain, had frozen in places. He shivered so violently his teeth chattered, a sound lost in the howling wind. The stray dog pressed against him, whimpering, seeking warmth neither of them had to give. Richard stood at his window, watching James's small form shake against the marble. His knuckles were white where he gripped the window frame. He had been standing there for 2 hours, unable to look away, unable to move. His assistant, Jennifer, entered with documents that needed signing. She spoke, but he did not respond. She followed his gaze down to the street. "Mr. Pemberton, sir." Richard did not turn. "How cold is it out there?" 8 degrees. Wind chill makes it feel like 15 below. Jennifer hesitated. "The man you've been watching, he's still there." "I know." "Sir, at these temperatures, hypothermia sets in within." "I know." The words came out sharper than he intended. Richard closed his eyes, pressed his forehead against the cold glass. When he spoke again, his voice was barely a whisper. "If I go down there, if I help him, I have to face it. Everything I've been avoiding, everyone I've failed." Jennifer said nothing for a moment. Then, quietly, "Or maybe you face the one person you haven't failed yet." Richard opened his eyes. Below, James had stopped shivering. That was worse. That meant his body was shutting down. Richard turned from the window and grabbed his coat. "Call down to the kitchen. Hot coffee, soup, blankets." "Sir?" "Now, Jennifer." His hand was already on the door. "And have Marcus meet me in the lobby. I'm going out." Richard emerged from the revolving doors wearing jeans and a plain black coat, items he had borrowed from the hotel's lost and found, because everything in his own closet screamed wealth. In his hands he carried a thermos of coffee and a thick wool blanket, still warm from the dryer in the hotel laundry. James looked up as footsteps approached, his eyes wary, his body tensing the way soldiers learn to tense when something unexpected enters their perimeter. The dog growled low in its throat. Richard stopped a respectful distance away, suddenly uncertain how to bridge the gap between their worlds. "Terrible night to be outside," he said, and immediately felt foolish for stating the obvious. James studied him for a long moment, trying to determine the angle, the catch. Because there was always a catch. "I've been through worse," he replied, his voice hoarse from the cold. Richard stepped closer, extending the thermos. "Coffee. Still hot. And a blanket. You don't have to take them, but I'd feel better if you did." James hesitated, then accepted both with a quiet, "Thank you, sir." His hands trembled as he wrapped them around the thermos, and Richard saw that his fingers were an alarming shade of white. They sat there in awkward silence for a moment, Richard settling against the marble column a few feet away, close enough to talk, but far enough to not invade the veteran's space. "You serve?" Richard asked, nodding toward the flag pin on James's jacket. Something shifted in James's expression, a flicker of pride that cut through the exhaustion. "Army. 3 tours in Afghanistan. 2nd Battalion, 75th Ranger Regiment." Richard's breath caught. "Michael's unit. What happened?" he asked, his voice barely audible over the wind. James glanced down at his leg, the prosthetic hidden beneath worn denim. "IED outside Kandahar. 7 years ago. I was on patrol with my squad. We were supposed to be heading back to base." He paused, took a sip of coffee, and Richard saw his jaw tighten. "I was lucky. I lived. 2 of my brothers didn't make it home that day." Richard felt something crack open inside his chest. "You're proud of your service. Despite everything." James looked at him then, really looked at him, and his eyes held a fierce clarity that spoke of unshakable conviction. "I'd do it again tomorrow, sir. Some things are worth more than legs, worth more than comfort." My country asked, and I answered. That's what we do. Richard sat there in the freezing wind, watching this broken man speak with more honor than anyone he had encountered in a decade of business dealings. And he understood with sudden, crushing certainty why he could not look away. Over the next 2 weeks, Richard returned every evening, always dressed in borrowed clothes, always carrying something small. A sandwich, a pair of dry socks. He never came empty-handed, but he never brought so much that it felt like charity. James began to expect him, even looked forward to their conversations, though he never said so aloud. They talked about small things at first. The weather, the city, the curious persistence of the stray dog, who James had named Scout, but gradually, carefully, the way soldiers learn to trust in foxholes, James began to reveal pieces of his life. He spoke of his daughter, Sarah, 24 years old, living somewhere in Wisconsin with a husband James had never met and a child he had never held. "She stopped answering my calls about 3 years ago," James said one night, his voice carefully neutral in that way that meant the wound still bled. "Can't say I blame her. Her mother died while I was deployed. And I came back too broken to be the father she needed. Some failures you can't fix with apologies." Richard listened with an intensity that made James uncomfortable sometimes, like this stranger was searching for something specific in his words. "Have you tried reaching out recently?" Richard asked. James shrugged, pulling the blanket tighter around his shoulders. "What would I say? Hey, honey. Dad's living on the street now. She deserves better than a father who couldn't keep his life together." The VA was another topic that brought bitterness to James's voice, a rare crack in his otherwise steady demeanor. His benefits had been denied on a technicality, some paperwork issue that he had tried for months to resolve before giving up. His prosthetic was outdated, painful on cold days. His medical care was a bureaucratic nightmare of missed appointments and lost files. "The system's broken," James said simply. "But I don't complain. There are guys worse off than me. At least I made it home." Richard wanted to tell him that survival was not the same as making it home, that living on the streets, with a body broken in service to your country, was an injustice that should never be accepted. But he said nothing, just listened, and in the listening began to understand the true depth of James's character. This was a man who had lost everything except his dignity, and he guarded that last possession with the fierce determination of a soldier defending his final position. James never asked Richard about himself, never pried into why a stranger would spend cold nights sitting on concrete with a homeless veteran. He simply accepted the friendship as another unexpected kindness in a world that had shown him precious little. And Richard, for the first time in 3 years, felt the ice around his heart begin to thaw. It was Tuesday evening, 12 days into their unlikely friendship, when James finally spoke about his wife. The temperature had risen above freezing for the first time in weeks, and something in the slight warmth seemed to loosen the grip James kept on his most painful memories. "Her name was Elena," he said quietly, staring at the coffee in his hands. "We met in high school, married at 20. She was the only person who ever really understood me, you know. The only one who saw past the uniform to whatever was underneath." Richard sat very still, afraid that any movement might stop the flow of words. "She got sick while I was on my second tour. Breast cancer. She didn't tell me how bad it was. Didn't want me distracted. Said she'd beat it before I got home." James's voice cracked, and he paused, swallowing hard. "She didn't beat it. She died 3 weeks before my rotation ended. My commanding officer told me over a satellite phone. I missed her funeral. Missed holding her hand. Missed saying goodbye." He reached into his jacket with trembling fingers and pulled out a plastic sleeve, the same one Richard had noticed that first night. Inside was a photograph, worn soft at the edges from years of handling. A woman with warm brown eyes and a smile that lit up her entire face. She stood in a garden, sunlight in her hair, looking at the camera with such love it hurt to witness. "She's beautiful," Richard whispered, and he meant it. James nodded, carefully returning the photo to his pocket, close to his heart. "Sarah looks just like her. Same eyes, same smile. That's probably why I can't face her. Every time I see my daughter, I see everything I lost, everything I failed to protect." Richard found his own hand moving to his chest, pressing against the place where his wallet held Michael's photo. "I lost someone too," he heard himself say, the words emerging without permission. "Someone who meant everything, and I wasn't there when it mattered either." James looked at him then, and in that look was understanding that transcended their circumstances, their differences, the secrets that still lay between them. "It's a special kind of hell, isn't it?" James said softly. "Surviving when they didn't. Waking up every day knowing you're here and they're not, and you can't even say if that's fair or unfair because nothing means anything anymore." Richard's throat tightened. "Yes," he managed. "That's exactly what it is." They sat together in the gathering darkness, two men who had lost everything that mattered, finding in each other's grief a mirror that reflected their own shattered souls. And Richard knew, with terrible certainty, that he could not maintain this deception much longer. Thursday evening arrived with clear skies and bitter cold. Richard was approaching the hotel's entrance from the street, having parked 2 blocks away as he always did to maintain his disguise, when he heard the laughter. 3 men in expensive suits emerged from the revolving doors, clearly intoxicated, their voices loud and brash. The man in the center, heavy-set with slicked-back hair and a cashmere coat that probably cost more than James earned in a year, spotted the veteran sitting against the marble column. "Look at this," the businessman said, his voice dripping with contempt. "Right outside a 5-star establishment. Disgusting." His associates laughed, one of them already pulling out his phone to record. The businessman walked directly to James's cup, the one containing perhaps $3 in change, the result of an entire day's quiet dignity. He drew his foot back and kicked it, hard, sending coins scattering across the sidewalk in a musical cascade of cruelty. "Oops," the man said, and his friends howled with laughter. James said nothing, His face remained carefully blank, the expression of a man who had endured this particular humiliation before and knew that reaction would only make it worse. He simply moved, slowly, his prosthetic leg making the motion awkward as he lowered himself to his hands and knees and began picking up the scattered coins one by one, his fingers shaking in the cold. The businessman and his associates were already walking away, still laughing, when Richard reached them. He moved fast, his hand shooting out to grip the businessman's shoulder and spin him around with a force that wiped the smile from the man's face. "You don't understand who you're dealing with," Richard said, and his voice was ice, each word sharp enough to cut. The rage in his eyes was something James had never seen, something that transformed Richard's entire presence from kind stranger to something far more dangerous. The businessman blinked, confused, starting to bluster about being touched. But Richard stepped closer, and whatever he saw in Richard's face made him go pale. Richard's hand was already reaching for his phone, ready to make a call that would destroy this man's career, his reputation, everything. But then he felt James's eyes on him. He turned and saw the veteran watching, confusion and dawning realization crossing his weathered face. Richard forced himself to release the businessman's shoulder, forced his breathing to steady. "Just go," he said quietly, the threat implicit in his tone. The three men hurried away, their earlier bravado evaporated. Richard stood there, trembling, aware that he had just revealed far more than he intended. Richard knelt beside James, helping him gather the last of the scattered coins. And that was when James saw it. The watch. Richard had forgotten to remove it in his anger. And now it caught the street light, gleaming on his wrist. James had seen enough luxury goods pass by on wealthy tourists to recognize quality. That watch cost more than most cars. James's eyes traveled from the watch to Richard's face, and suddenly other details clicked into place like pieces of a puzzle he had been unconsciously assembling. The way the doorman had nodded deferentially to Richard 2 nights ago when they crossed paths. The manner in which a passing hotel manager had said, "Good evening, sir," with a weight that suggested more than casual politeness. The fact that Richard always seemed to know when security would be making their rounds, as if he had access to their schedule. James straightened slowly, coins clutched in his fist, and looked at the man who had been visiting him for 2 weeks. "Who are you really?" The question hung in the cold air between them. Richard's expression shifted, became guarded. He glanced down at his watch as if seeing it for the first time. And James watched him make the calculation about whether to continue the lie. "I'm just someone who appreciates good people," Richard said carefully, his voice steady, but his eyes avoiding James's direct gaze. "That's all you need to know." James shook his head slowly. No. That's not all. Nobody just sits on cold concrete every night with a homeless veteran unless they have a reason. Nobody stands up to businessmen like you just did, with that kind of authority in their voice, unless they have power. He gestured toward the hotel. And the staff here, they know you. They defer to you. So I'll ask again, and I'd appreciate the truth. Who are you? Richard stood, his hands flexing at his sides, clearly torn between maintaining his deception and honoring the friendship they had built. "Does it matter?" he asked quietly. "Would it change anything between us if you knew?" James studied him for a long moment. This stranger who had shown him more kindness than anyone in years and felt something close to betrayal settling in his chest. "It matters because I thought we were being honest with each other. I told you about Elena, about Sarah, about everything I've lost. And you've been lying to me this whole time." Richard flinched, as if struck. "I never lied. I just didn't tell you everything." "That's the same thing," James said. And the disappointment in his voice was worse than anger would have been. Richard returned to his penthouse office and stood before the photograph he had been avoiding for 3 years. Michael Pemberton, 22 years old, 2nd Battalion, 75th Ranger Regiment, his son. Richard's hands trembled as he finally turned the frame to face him fully, forcing himself to look at the young man in dress uniform, at the pride and determination in eyes that mirrored his own. Michael had enlisted against Richard's wishes, had chosen service over the cushy corporate position waiting for him at Pemberton Industries. They had fought about it, said terrible things, and Michael had left for basic training with those words still hanging between them like shrapnel. Richard had been too proud, too stubborn to call and apologize. He had told himself there would be time after the deployment, after Michael came home and realized his father had been right. But Michael never came home. The IED had detonated outside Kandahar on a Tuesday morning 3 years ago, killing him instantly along with 2 other Rangers. The same region where James had lost his leg. Perhaps the same road, perhaps the same enemy. Richard had received the notification while, in a board meeting, had listened to the words with a numbness that never fully left. He had flown to Dover Air Force Base to receive the flag-draped coffin, had stood at attention while they folded the stars and stripes with military precision, had accepted the triangle of fabric that represented everything his son had been and everything Richard had failed to say. The guilt was suffocating. He had pushed Michael toward business, had mocked his idealism, had called his desire to serve naive and foolish, and Michael had died believing his father thought him a disappointment, never knowing that Richard's anger had been fear, that every harsh word had been a desperate attempt to keep his son safe by keeping him close. After the funeral, Richard had done what he knew best. He buried himself in work, expanded the hotel empire, made more money than he could spend in 10 lifetimes, and pushed away everyone who tried to reach him. His wife had left within a year, unable to bear his emotional absence. His friends stopped calling. He ate alone, slept alone, existed alone in a penthouse that was really just an expensive tomb. Then he had seen James, a veteran from Michael's unit, displaying the same quiet honor, the same selfless courage, the same unshakable dignity that Michael had shown. And Richard had become obsessed, watching this man the way he wished he had watched his son, trying to understand what created such character, such resilience, such grace under impossible circumstances. In James, Richard saw everything he had failed to appreciate in Michael while he was alive. Every act of kindness James performed was an echo of his son's values. Every moment of dignity was a rebuke to Richard's own failings as a father. He was not helping James out of simple compassion. He was trying to save the son he could not save, to honor the values he had mocked, to make amends for sins that could never be forgiven. And now James knew something was wrong, and Richard would have to decide whether to reveal the truth or lose the only connection to his son he had left. Richard had stayed away for 2 days after their confrontation, wrestling with the decision of whether to reveal himself or disappear from James's life entirely. But Friday night, guilt and concern drove him back to the hotel entrance at their usual time. What he found made his blood freeze. James was slumped against the marble column, unconscious, his skin gray and slick with fever sweat despite the cold. Scout the dog was whimpering, pawing at his chest, trying to wake him. Richard dropped to his knees, his hand going to James's neck to check for a pulse. It was there, rapid and thready. James's breathing came in shallow, labored gasps, and when Richard pulled back the veteran's jacket, he felt the terrifying heat radiating from his body. Pneumonia, probably for days, hidden behind James's stoic refusal to show weakness. Richard yanked out his phone, dialed emergency services with shaking fingers, then immediately called down to his security desk. "Get an ambulance to the main entrance now, and I need Marcus here immediately." He cradled James's head, feeling utterly helpless as the veteran's eyes fluttered open for just a moment, unfocused and glassy with fever. "Elena?" James whispered, and the hope in that single word shattered something in Richard's chest. The ambulance arrived within minutes, paramedics moving with efficient urgency. Richard climbed in without asking permission, his hand gripping James's as they raced toward Northwestern Memorial. In the emergency room, Richard stood back as doctors worked, but when the attending physician asked about insurance and next of kin, Richard stepped forward. He made calls, quiet and discreet, to hospital administrators he knew personally. Money transferred through accounts that could not be traced back to him. Private room. Best pulmonary specialist in Chicago. Every test, every medication, every comfort. All arranged through intermediaries. All attributed to an anonymous benefactor. James drifted in and out of consciousness for 3 days, his fever raging, his lungs fighting to clear the infection. When he finally woke, truly woke, Richard was not there. He had watched over James every night, leaving only in the mornings before the veteran could see him. The doctors told James he had been brought in by a good Samaritan who wished to remain anonymous. And James, still weak and confused, accepted this explanation because his memory of that night was nothing but fever dreams and fragmented images. But he knew, somewhere deep in his consciousness, that Richard had saved his life. James opened his eyes to afternoon sunlight streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows, and for a disoriented moment, he thought he had died and gone somewhere he did not deserve. The hospital room was nothing like the crowded wards he remembered from his VA visits. This was a private suite with a comfortable chair by the window, artwork on the walls, and equipment that looked brand new. A television mounted on the wall showed the news on mute. Even the sheets felt expensive against his skin. He tried to sit up, his chest still tight but no longer burning with each breath. And a nurse appeared almost immediately, her smile warm and genuine. "Easy, Mr. Mitchell. You've been very sick. Pneumonia. You were touch and go there for a while." James's voice came out raspy. "How long?" 4 days. But you're through the worst of it now. Doctor says you'll make a full recovery." He looked around the room again, confusion mounting. "I don't understand. I don't have insurance. I can't afford this place. There's been some mistake." The nurse's expression softened. "No mistake. You have a benefactor, someone who wants to help. That's all I can tell you." Before James could press further, there was a knock at the door, and Richard entered, carrying a cup of coffee and looking more exhausted than James had ever seen him. Relief washed visibly across Richard's face when their eyes met. "You're awake. Thank God." James felt emotion tighten his throat. "You found me. You called for help." Richard nodded, moving to the chair beside the bed, unable to completely hide the intensity of his relief. "You weren't at your spot at the usual time. I found you unconscious. I rode with you in the ambulance. Then you saved my life," James said quietly. "I don't know how to thank you for that." Richard shook his head, and there was something broken in his expression, something that went beyond concern for a friend. "You don't owe me thanks, James. If anything, I owe you more than you could possibly understand." James studied him, seeing the expensive watch again, the quality of his clothes beneath the plain jacket, the way he carried himself with unconscious authority. "Who's paying for all this?" "This room, these doctors." The nurse said, "I have a benefactor." Richard met his eyes, and James saw him make another decision to deflect, to maintain the wall between them. "Sometimes people want to help. Does it matter who?" "Yes," James said firmly. "It matters. I'm not a charity case." "No," Richard agreed, his voice suddenly fierce. "You're not. You're a hero who deserves far better than sleeping on concrete. And whoever is helping you clearly believes that too." While James slept in his hospital room, Richard returned to his office and became a man on a mission. He sat at his massive desk with files spread before him, the city lights glinting off glass and chrome as he made call after call, each one carefully calculated to rebuild a life that should never have fallen apart. His first call was to his head of security, Marcus, who also happened to be former military with connections throughout the veteran community. "I need everything you can find on James Mitchell. Service record, medical history, VA claims. Anything that explains how a decorated ranger ended up on the street." Marcus had the information within 6 hours. The story it told made Richard's jaw clench with anger. James had filed for disability benefits after his discharge, but his claim had been denied due to missing paperwork that the VA itself had lost. His appeals had gone nowhere. Trapped in bureaucratic limbo. His medical care had been inconsistent. His prosthetic outdated because the approval for a new one required evaluations he could never schedule because the VA clinic was perpetually overbooked. It was not a story of a man who had failed. It was a story of a system that had failed him. Richard made another call, this one to Senator Patricia Hughes, who owed him several favors and sat on the Veterans Affairs Committee. "Patricia, I need your help with a case. A veteran who fell through the cracks. I'm sending you the file now." By the end of the conversation, James's VA benefits were being expedited for review, His medical care was being transferred to a top-tier provider who worked with veterans, and a new prosthetic was already being fitted to his measurements. But it was the next call that proved most difficult. Richard's private investigator had located Sarah Mitchell in Madison, Wisconsin. She was married, working as a teacher, had a 3-year-old son named Matthew, and according to social media posts his investigator had found, she spent every Father's Day visiting her mother's grave alone, posting about the father she had lost not to death, but to distance. Richard stared at her phone number for 20 minutes before dialing. When she answered, her voice was cautious, clearly not recognizing the number. "Sarah Mitchell?" "Yes." "Who is this?" Richard chose his words carefully. "My name is Richard Pemberton. You don't know me, but I've become acquainted with your father. I'm calling because I think there are things you both need to say to each other. And time is more precious than either of you realize." There was a long silence. When Sarah spoke again, her voice was thick with emotion. "Is he okay? Is my dad okay? He's in the hospital recovering from pneumonia. He's going to be fine. But Sarah, he talks about you. About how much he regrets losing you. About how he sees your mother in your face and it breaks his heart." He heard her breath catch, heard what might have been a sob. "He never calls. He never tries. Because he thinks he doesn't deserve you," Richard said gently. "Because he's ashamed of what he's become. But that doesn't mean he stopped loving you. It means he loved you too much to drag you into his pain." The conversation lasted an hour. By the end, Sarah had agreed to come to Chicago. Richard made his final calls that evening to his hotel staff. He had the maintenance supervisor meet him in a vacant suite on the 4th floor. Modest but comfortable, with a view of the city and space enough for a man to rebuild his dignity. "I want this prepared for long-term residence. Furnished, simply but well. And I want a position created in hotel maintenance, starting immediately." Jennifer, his assistant, appeared in the doorway. "Sir, what exactly are you doing?" Richard looked up from his desk, and for the first time in 3 years, there was something like purpose in his eyes. "What I should have done for my son when he needed it. I'm making sure a good man doesn't slip through the cracks again." James was discharged on a Tuesday morning, 6 days after he had collapsed on the street. He stood in the hospital lobby wearing donated clothes, a bag of prescriptions in his hand, and absolutely no idea where to go next. His corner outside the Pemberton Hotel had certainly been claimed by now. The thought of starting over, of finding a new spot, of rebuilding from nothing again, filled him with a weariness that had nothing to do with his recovering lungs. Richard was waiting by the entrance, and the relief on his face when he saw James was almost painful to witness. "I have something to discuss with you," Richard said, gesturing toward his car. A vehicle James now noticed was a Mercedes, understated but expensive. They drove in silence to the Pemberton Hotel, and Richard led him not to the street entrance but through a side door into the service corridors James had only glimpsed from outside. They ended up in a small office where the maintenance supervisor waited, with paperwork spread across a desk. "We have an opening in hotel maintenance," Richard said, his voice carefully casual in a way that made James's suspicion flare immediately. "Full-time. Benefits. Fair wages. Living quarters can be arranged in one of our extended stay suites until you get on your feet. The job is yours if you want it." James stared at him, then at the paperwork, then back at Richard. Just like that. A job. An apartment. After I've been living on the street for 2 years. You're qualified. You're reliable. You have skills we need. "Stop," James said, his voice hard. "Just stop with the polite fiction. This isn't about skills or qualifications. You've been orchestrating my life for weeks now. The hospital, the anonymous benefactor, and now this. A job that appears out of nowhere, perfectly timed, with housing included." He stepped closer to Richard, and there was anger in his eyes now, mixed with hurt. "Why are you doing this? You don't even know me. Nobody does this for a stranger. Nobody watches a homeless veteran for weeks, saves his life, pays his medical bills, offers him a job and a home. Unless there's a reason. So tell me the truth, Richard. or whoever you really are. What am I to you? Some kind of project? A way to feel good about yourself? Richard's composure cracked. You want to know why? Because every time I look at you, I see everything I failed to appreciate. Everything I lost. Everything I can never get back. What does that mean? James demanded. Richard's hands were shaking now, his carefully maintained control finally shattering. It means you remind me of someone I loved more than my own life and lost because I was too proud, too blind, too stubborn to tell him what he meant to me. Richard walked to the window, his back to James, and when he spoke again, his voice was raw with 3 years of suppressed grief. His name was Michael. Michael Pemberton. My son. He was 22 years old when he died in Kandahar 3 years ago. Your unit. James went very still, the anger draining from his face, replaced by dawning understanding and something close to devastation. Richard pulled out his wallet with trembling hands, extracted a photograph, and turned to face James. He held it out, and James took it carefully, as if it were made of glass. The young man in the photo wore the same uniform James had worn, stood at the same proud attention, wore the same expression of fierce determination. He enlisted against my wishes, Richard continued, the words pouring out now like water through a broken dam. I wanted him to take over the business, to stay safe, to follow the path I had laid out for him. We fought about it. Terrible things were said. He left for basic training, and I told myself I would make him understand when he came home, that he would see I had been right all along. Richard's voice broke, but he never came home. An IED outside Kandahar killed him instantly, along with 2 other rangers, and the last words I ever said to my son were that he was throwing his life away on a fool's errand. James looked down at the photograph, his own hands shaking now, and Richard saw recognition in his eyes. I knew him, James whispered. Not well, but I knew him. He was in Charlie Company. We crossed paths on base. He was a good kid, eager, wanted to make a difference. Richard felt tears he had not allowed himself to shed for 3 years burning in his eyes. After he died, I buried myself in work. I pushed everyone away. I existed, but I didn't live. And then one night, I looked out my window from my penthouse office 50 floors above the street, and I saw you, a veteran from his unit, sleeping on the concrete outside my hotel, and I watched you help that elderly woman. I watched you give away your food, help strangers, maintain your dignity against impossible odds, and I saw in you everything I had mocked in my son, every value I had dismissed as naive idealism, every quality I had been too blind to appreciate until it was too late. He moved closer to James, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. I'm not helping you to feel good about myself, James. I'm helping you because you are living proof that my son's values, his honor, his selflessness, were real and right and worth more than all the money I've made in my entire life. You are everything I failed to see in Michael while he was alive. And I've been watching you because somehow, in helping you, in seeing you survive with grace and dignity, I could believe that my son's sacrifice meant something, that the qualities I mocked were actually the only things that truly matter. James stood frozen, the photograph still in his hands, tears streaming down his weathered face. I'm Richard Pemberton. I own this hotel. I own 37 hotels across the country. I'm a billionaire who would give every cent I have to tell my son one more time that I was proud of him, that I was wrong, that he was the best thing I ever created. But I can't. So instead, I'm standing here, begging you to let me honor his memory by helping you. Not as charity, as penance, as the only way I know to make amends for failing the person who mattered most. James handed the photograph back with shaking hands, then sank into a chair as if his legs could no longer support him. He pressed his palms against his eyes, and when he spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. I'm not what you think I am. I'm just a broken man who couldn't keep his life together, who lost his wife, who drove away his daughter, who ended up sleeping on the street like trash. I'm not some symbol of honor or dignity. I'm just trying to survive each day without giving up entirely." Richard pulled a chair close and sat facing him, leaning forward with an intensity that demanded James meet his eyes. "You're wrong. You think survival is nothing? You think maintaining your humanity while the world treats you as invisible is ordinary? James, I've spent 3 years surrounded by wealth and power, by people who would do anything for money, and I've never met anyone with a fraction of your character. You had nothing, and you still helped that elderly woman. You still shared your food with a stray dog. You still gave shelter to a stranger while you froze in the rain. That's not just survival. That's grace under fire. That's everything my son believed in." James shook his head, tears spilling down his cheeks. "I think about Elena every single day. I think about how I wasn't there when she needed me most. I think about Sarah growing up without either of her parents because I was too broken to be what she needed. Some nights on that concrete, I wondered if it would be easier to just stop fighting, to let the cold win. If that's grace, it's the cheapest kind." Richard felt his own tears falling freely now, all pretense abandoned. "After Michael died, I stood on my balcony more than once and looked down and wondered if the fall would hurt or if it would just be relief. I know what it's like to wake up every morning wishing you hadn't. I know what it's like to survive someone you love and feel guilty for every breath you take." They sat there in that small office, two men who had never been more different on paper, two men who had never been more similar in their hearts, and something profound passed between them. Not pity, not charity, recognition. "We're both ghosts," James said quietly, "walking around in a world that moved on without the people who made it worth living in." Richard nodded. "But maybe ghosts can help each other remember what it feels like to be alive. Maybe that's what we need. Not to forget them, but to honor them by not giving up the way we both want to." James looked at him then, really looked at him, and saw not a billionaire playing savior, but a father drowning in grief who had found in a homeless stranger the only lifeline that made sense. "I don't know if I can do this. Accept your help. Take this job. I don't know if I deserve it." Richard reached out and gripped James's shoulder. "My son died believing I thought he was a disappointment. Don't let your daughter grow up believing you didn't love her enough to try. We've both failed the people we loved. Maybe we can stop failing now." Sarah Mitchell arrived at the hotel 2 days later, and Richard met her in the lobby before taking her to see her father. She was 24. With her mother's warm eyes and dark hair, wearing jeans and a worn jacket that suggested she had driven straight through from Madison without stopping. Her hands twisted nervously around her purse strap, and Richard could see she was terrified. "He doesn't know you're coming," Richard said gently as they rode the elevator to the 4th-floor suite where James was now staying. "I thought it might be easier this way. Less time for either of you to overthink it." Sarah nodded, blinking back tears. "I haven't seen him in 3 years. What if he doesn't want to see me? What if I'm too late?" Richard thought of Michael, of all the conversations they would never have, and his voice was firm. "You're not too late. That's what matters." He knocked on the door, then opened it. James was sitting by the window, and when he turned and saw his daughter standing in the doorway, the color drained from his face. "Sarah?" His voice was barely a whisper. She stood frozen, and the silence stretched painful and long. Richard could see the years of hurt and longing warring in both their faces. Finally, Sarah spoke, her voice shaking. "You look terrible." James gave a broken laugh. "I've looked better." Another silence. Sarah's jaw tightened. And suddenly the words burst out of her like a dam breaking. "You stopped calling. After Mom died, after you came home, you just shut down. You pushed me away every time I tried to help. You wouldn't talk to me, wouldn't let me in, and eventually you just disappeared. Do you have any idea what that was like? Losing Mom and then losing you too?" James stood, his prosthetic leg making him unsteady, and tears were streaming down his face. "I know. God, Sarah, I know. And I'm so sorry. When I came back and she was gone, I couldn't face you. Every time I looked at you, I saw her. I saw everything I failed to protect, everyone I couldn't save. I was drowning, and I thought the kindest thing I could do was not drag you down with me. Sarah's anger crumbled into grief. "But I needed my dad. I needed you, and you weren't there." James crossed the room, and Richard watched as father and daughter stood face to face, 3 years of pain between them. "I was wrong," James said, his voice breaking completely. "I was so wrong, Sarah. I thought I was protecting you, but I was just running away. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry for every call I didn't return, every birthday I missed, every moment I let my grief matter more than your love." Sarah collapsed into his arms, sobbing, and James held her like he was holding the last precious thing in the world. Richard turned away, giving them privacy, but not before he saw James mouth the words, "Thank you," over his daughter's shoulder. And Richard understood that sometimes saving one person was enough to make 3 years of grief mean something. James started work at the Pemberton Hotel on a Monday morning, wearing a maintenance uniform with his name embroidered over the pocket. It was the first time in 7 years he had worn anything with his name on it that wasn't a label marking him as homeless or broken. Richard had insisted on fair terms. The salary was standard for the position, not inflated by guilt or pity. The apartment on the 4th floor was modest. A studio with a small kitchen and a view of the alley. And James paid rent from his paycheck, reduced but not eliminated. It was not charity, it was a chance. And that made all the difference. The hotel staff had been briefed carefully. They knew James was a veteran, knew he had fallen on hard times, knew their boss had taken a personal interest in helping him rebuild. What surprised James was how quickly respect replaced the invisible wall that had existed when he slept outside their doors. Marcus, the head of security, was former Marine and made a point of shaking James's hand his first day. "Rangers lead the way," he said simply, and James understood he was among people who understood. The housekeeping staff invited him to lunch. The front desk manager asked about his service with genuine interest. Within 2 weeks, James was not the charity case. He was simply James, a colleague, a fellow worker, a man earning his place. But it was what happened next that truly transformed him. Richard introduced him to his network of veteran service organizations, foundations, and advocacy groups. James began volunteering his evenings, visiting shelters, talking to homeless veterans who reminded him of the man he had been just weeks before. He knew their stories because he had lived their story. He knew their shame, their pride, their desperate need to maintain dignity even when the world treated them as less than human. He became a bridge between Richard's resources and the people who needed them most. Through the foundation Richard established in Michael's name, James helped connect veterans with housing, medical care, job training, and most importantly, hope. He did not preach or lecture. He simply sat with them, shared coffee, listened to their pain, and told them that survival was not weakness, that asking for help was not surrender, that they deserved better than the streets, and slowly, one by one, lives began to change. On Sundays, James had dinner with Richard and Sarah, who visited from Madison every other weekend, bringing her son Matthew. The little boy called Richard Uncle Richard and sat on James's lap asking questions about soldiers and heroes. They were not a conventional family, but they were family nonetheless. 3 broken people who had found in each other's brokenness a reason to keep trying, to keep hoping, to keep believing that redemption was possible even after the worst losses. Richard no longer ate alone in his penthouse. And somewhere, in a way neither of them could fully explain, they both felt that Michael and Elena were watching. And perhaps finally at peace. 6 months after that freezing December night, the Michael Pemberton Foundation for Homeless Veterans opened its doors in downtown Chicago. The building was modest but welcoming, with resources for housing assistance, medical care, job training, and mental health services all under one roof. James stood at the entrance beside Richard, both men wearing suits for the occasion, though James kept tugging at his collar uncomfortably. Sarah stood nearby with 3-year-old Matthew perched on her hip, the little boy waving an American flag and asking loudly when Grandpa could show him around. The press was there, cameras flashing. But Richard had insisted this moment was not about publicity. It was about Michael. It was about James. It was about every veteran who had ever slept on cold concrete while a grateful nation looked away. During the ribbon cutting, Richard spoke briefly about his son. His voice steady now, in a way it had not been for years. He spoke about honor and sacrifice, about the values that made some people run toward danger while others ran away. And then he invited James to speak, and the room fell silent as the former homeless veteran stepped to the microphone. James kept it short, the way soldiers do. He talked about the brothers and sisters still on the streets, about the debt America owed to those who served, about second chances, and the power of one person choosing to see another's humanity. His voice cracked only once, when he mentioned Elena and said he wished she could see that he had finally found his way home. After the ceremony, Richard and James stood alone in the Foundation's memorial room, where Michael's photograph hung alongside the photos of other fallen service members. James wore his hotel maintenance uniform beneath his borrowed suit jacket, having come straight from his morning shift. And there was something profound in that image. A man who had lost everything, now standing with dignity restored. Not because someone had rescued him, but because someone had seen him. Richard looked different too. The haunted emptiness in his eyes had been replaced by something alive, something purposeful. He would never stop grieving his son, but he had learned to let that grief fuel something meaningful rather than letting it destroy him. They stood together in comfortable silence, two men who had saved each other without either one fully understanding how. Outside, the Chicago streets bustled with life. But if you walked past the Pemberton Hotel and looked carefully at the marble columns where James once slept, you would see something new. A small bronze plaque installed at Richard's request, bearing words that changed everything for those who needed to hear them. The plaque read simply, "To those who serve with honor, you are seen." Because sometimes salvation begins with a single act of observation, with one person choosing to look down from their tower and truly see the humanity in another. Sometimes two broken souls find each other in the darkness and discover that together they can build a light strong enough to guide others home. And sometimes, just sometimes, the greatest gift we can give is not money or power or comfort, but the simple recognition that every person, no matter how far they have fallen, carries within them a dignity that can never be taken away, only forgotten, and always, always